Okay, welcome everybody to a new episode of Black, Brown, Yellow, White. Today I am very happy and excited to have with us Dr. Alena Lentin, a leading expert on race and racism studies from Western Sydney University. Dr. Lentin's work delves into the complexities of race, ethnicity, and migration, and it offers us a deeper understanding of these critical issues. Dr. Lentin has authored several impactful works, including Why Race Still Matters, where she argues that race does remain a vital issue in today's society. Then another important text is The Crises of Multiculturalism, Racism in a Neoliberal Age, co-authored with Gavan Titley, which explores the challenges of multicultural policies. And more recently, she has been a part of the seminar Taking Action for Palestine in Academic and Cultural Institutions, as well as co-authoring or co-publishing with Nicole Mary Burton a graphic essay titled Not Racism. So I'm very excited to get to talk to you today about these difficult issues. But before we leap into the heart of the matter, I do think it would be, I know it's very difficult, but maybe for our viewers to get kind of in a nutshell, your biography, you kind of your way to arriving at this point to get an idea of who you are.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for this lovely introduction and for the kind invitation to join you on your podcast. So yeah, a little bit about me. I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal Wangal people, otherwise known as Sydney, Australia, where I've been a migrant settler for the last 12 years now. I moved here from the UK, which is where I was working as a sociologist, and now I teach, as you said, in cultural and social analysis at Western Sydney University. So how did I get to do this work? Well, you mentioned the seminar that we recently held at the university on taking action on Palestine, and that sort of gives you a clue to where I'm coming from. So I was actually born on occupied Palestinian land, otherwise known as Israel, where I was born, but I didn't grow up there. I moved to Ireland and was part of the Irish Jewish community during my childhood and up until the late teenage years. And so really, I guess my commitment to anti-racism is formed by that experience of growing up as a member of an extreme minority group at the time. So Ireland has become a more multicultural country. Of course, without giving the whole history, Ireland was colonized by the British for 800 years. A part of the country remains under colonization. But it was very monolithically a Catholic country, at least the south of Ireland remains monolithically Catholic. It's more multicultural today, but certainly when I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, that was not the experience. Yeah. And so I think that experience of being marginalized and being an outsider in society really turned me on to the question of racism from a very young age. And I was very involved in anti-racism politics as a student and as a young person, going back to the early 1990s. Yeah. And then following some, I guess, dissatisfaction with the kind of organizing I was involved in at the time, I decided to go back to university, and I did a master's degree and I did a study of anti-racism movement. And from then I was, I continued to be interested in that question, and I went on to do a PhD on anti-racism movements and discourses in Europe, which turned into my first book, which was Racism and Anti-Racism in Europe, which was published in 2004. Yeah. And so I come from that European background of anti-racism. And as I said, more recently moved to Gadigal Wangal land.
Yeah. Thank you very much for giving us an idea of your complex biography. Now, I think I have to apologize a bit because my questions in a way are going to be a bit naive, but the idea is to get how can I put this, to get kind of the same or to get at similar topics between all the different interviews and across all the different regions, and and all the different places. So the beginning circles around your sources of inspiration. So
Hmm.
the first one would be in terms of um, one could say maybe your role models or personal heroes or yeah, sources of inspiration. Were there people, the personal, historical figures, activists, etc., where you got impulses from and that really resonated with you?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, to be honest with you, as somebody who's very much, in fact, quite self-taught on the issues of race, I never had any teachers or even professors at university who ever taught me any course on race.
Yeah,
And I find it quite paradoxical to now be somebody who's in the position of teaching on these subjects. And
yeah,
so I really had to struggle to find my way to find out what it was, who was going to guide me, what thinking was going to guide me with absolutely no teaching. So where I sought my inspiration, and as I said, I came out of an anti-racist organizing background, where I
hmm,
sought my inspiration was from movements themselves. And so when I started doing my studies, I was mainly reading the texts
yeah,
and the histories of those movements, particularly. So the four countries I looked at in my PhD were France, the UK, Italy, and Ireland, and
hmm,
particularly the French anti-colonial struggle and the struggle of Black people in the United Kingdom. Um, you know, it's a problematic term today, but political
yeah,
blackness. So it wasn't thought of as only people from Africa and the Caribbean, but also people from South Asia and so on, working together in solidarity due to their
hmm,
shared experience of the migration regime and racist policing. And so the kind of things like speeches and leaflets and magazines that were produced by these
yeah,
organizations were my first inspiration. And so that then led me to, through conversations that I had with activists to think about, well, what are the main, where were they getting their inspiration from?
yeah,
So for a lot of activists in the United Kingdom, for example, it was the Pan-African congresses going back to the early 1900s, where, of course, we
hmm,
know a figure like W.E.B. Du Bois, who today is often thought of as one of the fathers of sociology, but of course, as the Black study, he doesn't like to be called a Black studies theorist, but more he talks about Black study. Josh
yeah,
Myers wrote about in his book of Black study of Du Bois that he doesn't really like the pigeonholing of him in
hmm,
sociology or in history or in any other particular discipline. And he talks
yeah,
about Black study being a kind of an anti-disciplining project, right? So it's
yeah,
opposed to the idea of disciplining in all of its kind of in all of its manifestations and all of its meanings, but really that history of the Pan-African and the anti-colonial forces of
hmm,
the third world coming together to talk and to theorize about the struggle for liberation. So that was a major inspiration for me. Of course, that brings up figures like Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney, the African and Caribbean Marxists, and later
yeah,
on, I suppose, the decolonial theorists, and more recently, the person whose work I've been very much guided by and inspired by, and whose work is really grounding the writing that I'm doing at the moment, is the Black Studies scholar Cedric Robinson, who authored the sort of the famous text Black Marxism, which he
yeah,
published in 1983, but also another book that I'm very much influenced by, which is called Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, in which he develops the idea of racial regimes, which is a concept that I'm working with at the moment to think about, well, what does race look like in the particular conjuncture? Another key figure who I have to mention, of course, is Stuart Hall, who was a Caribbean scholar and activist who wrote so many important works on race, and particularly the link between race and class, or the way in which we can't really think about these two things as separate, but we always have to think about them together. So that's a few of my key influences, I guess.
yeah. So there's a rich layering of influences there from the activists over to these different Pan-African scholars. And I was curious, sorry, can you hear me well with this kind of
Yeah.
drilling going on? Okay. Because yeah, there's on my side it's very loud. Anyway, so there's this rich layering of sources of inspiration, and I'm curious, is there are there also, if you look at the cultural side of the human enterprise, like novels, movies, pieces of art,
Mm.
are there also some that stand out to you in your mind as influencing your perspective or somehow impacting you significantly?
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who has always read a lot of literature, but if you put me on the spot and you ask me who is the person who inspired you the most in terms of, it's always difficult for me. It's like
Yeah,
my daughter always asks me, what's your favorite movie or what's your favorite piece of music? I always find it
yeah.
really hard to answer. But of course, I always read a lot of African American literature, James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. Um, I one of the books that I was inspired by the most is Sam Selvin's The Lonely Londoners, for example. Also, a lot of kind of, I guess, Indian subcontinent literature,
Hmm.
which I know is a little bit contentious. A lot of those authors who wrote in English, somebody like Rohinton Mistry, I read his books when I
Yeah.
was very young, and I was always very impacted by them, which was interesting because later on I spent quite a lot of time in Mumbai, which is the
Hmm.
city that he set his novels in.
Um, Okay, so I also get a sense of from what you've been telling me so far that you have a rich biographical itinerary across this globe. So I was interested, going back to the idea of sources of inspirations in your travel, studies, and journeys across the globe. Have you encountered perhaps practices or traditions that uh, have stayed with you or that have left, some kind of imprint?
Wow, so many. Well, so you're right. I mean, I've lived in a lot of different places. So as I said, I grew up in Ireland, and it's relatively interesting and quite sad that growing up, I, well, we had to learn about the Irish language. We
Hmm.
learned the Irish language in school, and we learned Irish history, but we
Yeah.
didn't learn it in a way that I think we're a little bit more attentive to in many education systems today, which is in a kind of taking a decolonial approach. So, despite the
Mm.
fact that a lot of the history that we learned was about the Irish overthrowing of British colonialism,
Yeah.
it wasn't described in those terms. So the language, we never discussed the concept of or the concept or the practice or the
Yeah.
institutions of colonialism. We spoke about Irish nationalism. And so it was always toward the founding of a state, the creation of a state. So the important cultural influences of the Irish nationalist struggle were kind of absent from the way in which I mean, I think it was different depending on the setting that people were in, the familial setting, the
Yeah.
communal setting, but certainly I went to a Jewish school. So for
Mhm.
other, kids in our school, it was almost strange to say, but almost like an external culture for us,
Yeah.
despite the fact that we were living there. So I think that's something that you know, I'm replying to your question in the negative. It's almost like what did I not have rather than what did
Yeah.
I have, right? But I actually think that's really important because for me today, and considering my understanding of colonialism and anti-colonialism today, and therefore my commitment to the Irish anti-colonial struggle. It's
Yeah.
interesting that I didn't have that formation growing up. I had to find out about those things later on. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same for lots of people. If you talk to people who grew up at a certain, and perhaps also still today, in certain formerly colonized countries, that the
Mhm.
education, particularly in the British system, a lot of
Yeah.
those education systems remain even still today, still very colonial
Yeah.
in their orientation in terms of what's given value, what languages are given value, what literary texts are given value, what versions or understandings of history are given value. That's still what the theorists would call coloniality. We're still imbibed in this kind of colonial era, in this colonial epistemic outlook. So I guess for me, I was always more trained on Jewish culture, particularly
Mhm.
Eastern European culture. So my family is Romanian on one side and Lithuanian on the other side.
Yeah.
When I was a young person in my early 20s, I went to work in Eastern Europe, in Hungary,
Yeah.
where I was
Nice.
involved in sort of Jewish student movements
Mhm.
and organizing. And I also spent a lot of time in France and in Italy. So I spent 7 years in Italy. So that's where I did my PhD.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I kind of feel a connection to a more Mediterranean culture, I suppose, which, you could ask questions about that in terms of where I was, where I started my early life and so on. So it's hard, I think, actually being in this. And it's interesting, once I met somebody, a philosopher, and he asked me these questions about myself and where I come from, and I gave him this kind of story about, well, I've lived here and I've lived there and I was born here and so on. And he said, well, you're the quintessential European in a sense, because you have this kind of transnational, or kind of which is interesting when we think about the rise. Well, some people call it the rise of the far right, or we could argue, we could call it European fascism, particularly. We're in a particularly dangerous era at the moment. There's all this kind of talk about being indigenous to a particular nation state. But of course, if we look at the longue durée of European history, we know that this is completely bogus, that European peoples have always migrated and traveled around and moved from place to place. So for him to say to me, you're the quintessential European because you moved around, conflicts with this idea that many Europeans have of themselves, that I am indigenous to this place, and you, the migrant, is the usurper of my true position, right? But what it means, just to finish, what it means is that you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, like you never really know what and who you are, and I think that's something that is enriching when you're older, but can be very confusing when you're at an earlier stage of your life.
Yeah, because the myth of this kind of almost monolithic identity still has quite of a tight grip on our society, I believe, often.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just sorry, I was just reminded now when you said 7 years Italy. My dad, my father was from South Africa, and he was living for a long time in Italy because he was going to the priest school in Rome. And so when I was growing up, looking back, and when we were growing up with him, there was always like, in certain aspects, he came across to me in my mental imagery as Italian, when he would have such an easy fluency with it, and when he would sing songs by Pavarotti and things like this. So I sometimes had this image of him as not just Xhosa and South African, but also Italian. So, like you say, these different identities can be stacked one next to the other in a way.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you can have, I guess, positive experiences of places. I'm thinking of probably your father's experience. I mean, certainly when I was living in Italy in the early 2000s, late 1990s and early 2000s, and I was involved with a lot of one particular migrant worker organization, our migrant community organization. And there's a huge amount of racism against African people in Italy, which is also, I think, to do with Italy's almost completely unacknowledged, lack of acknowledgement of its colonial history in Ethiopia in particular, but also just in general, against migrants who often find themselves in an extremely precarious and dangerous position, both as workers within the Italian economy, but just living in the space. It's one of the most racistly violent places, while at the same time having this veneer of a kind of an enjoyable life, which really, I think that clash is very present for people. It was very obvious to me when I was living there.
Okay, so I would seg now on to, we could always call it a bit the more heavy or more challenging issues at the core of this interview series. And you are the specialist on this, so I feel a bit bad about asking it so naively. But fundamentally, what is your understanding of racism, and what do you perceive as its causes, effects, etc.?
Okay, small question.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I prefer to talk about race rather than racism. And I know that can be a little bit confusing because for most people, and I try to argue this, for most people, racism or ideas about human inferiority, um, degrees of proximity or distance from the ideal humanity, which is usually cast in the image of white European man, etc. That
Yeah.
this kind of ideology, which people date at different times, there's a lot of debate in the literature as
Hmm.
to when these ideas came about. But people tend to think that this ideology, and we think about this as being kind of a formed idea and some people think it's kind of universal.
Yeah.
Other people would argue that it's a European production. I would certainly argue that. But this produces the concept of race. And race, from that perspective, is understood as a way of categorizing people on the basis of the connection that's made between their genetic material, if you like,
Yeah.
and their human abilities. Yeah. And so people think of those kind of taxonomies of race that were created or delineated by so-called racial scientists in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, moving from kind of
Yeah.
physical anthropology to kind of more hard science, etc. And then, of course, to social Darwinism, eugenics, and all of those kinds of things.
Mm.
Now, the way I look at it is rather different because I think about race as a technology for the management of human difference. And
Hmm.
what I mean by that is that there's a set of projects and processes which develop over quite a long period of time, which then get given the name of racism
Hmm.
as a kind of an ideology. So actually, the direction of travel is the opposite to what most people tend to think, because I just simply don't believe that there was kind of a fully formed ideology that produces this version, right? So
Yeah.
what you actually see historically are different ideas about what constitutes humanity and
Hmm.
gradations of humanity that evolve at different times. So you have a kind of a religious idea of that. You can see this very much within the 1492 moment, the invasion of the Americas, where you have, for example, the famous Valladolid debate between
Yeah.
Sepulveda and De las Casas, where they're debating whether an indigenous person can be considered human because, as a non-Christian, as a heathen, is
Yeah.
it possible at all to consider this person a human? You have a geographical version of this, which is to do with this kind of theorization of different areas of the world being constituted differently in relation to European man. And then as a third stage of that, you have this kind of biological or genetic argument. But that's really the last piece. So this kind of creating of this systematic taxonomy is actually the last piece. It's not the first piece, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really, so as soon as you see it like that, you think to yourself, okay, so what's going on, right? What is the necessity to create all these different ways for really trying to divide among people and demarcate them and categorize them and hierarchize them? What's happening? And then
Yeah.
you try to think, okay, so what's the utility of that? And somebody like Cedric Robinson, but also Geraldine Heng in her book on race and the invention of race in the Middle Ages. Cedric Robinson with his focus on the feudalist era. And we'll take this history a lot further back. Robinson, for example, looks at the movement of different workers within, during early capitalism, so different migrants, very similar to the kind of situation that we're familiar with. So people
Hmm.
having to move for the purposes of migration
Yeah.
and being put to work in different kind of types of labor at different times in different places. And so different populations become enslaved to fulfill the necessity of early capitalists at this time. So what you have then is this kind of designation of particular people as enslavable. And Robinson's idea is that this is what then creates the idea of kind of differentiation, which he says is the tendency of European civilization going back a long time. I mean, he actually takes us back to antiquity, because what you see evolving within the European context, which evolves along with the growth of capitalism, is this ability or this necessity to differentiate between people rather than to homogenize them. And he says this is what constitutes Europeanness as a type of culture, as a type of civilizational set of practices that distinguishes it from other areas of the world. And because these practices were already evolved within Europe itself over quite a long period of time, once Europeans start to invade and colonize and conquer other areas of the world, they already have this way of relating to different groups of people that they can then enact or put into practice in other places. And he says, you know, his idea is more convincing, or he argues that it's a more convincing idea, that the idea which is about, you know, clash of civilizations. So Europeans go to, you know, go to the Americas, and then later on go to Africa and so on, see people who are different to them, and then kind of create this idea, or, you know, theorize this idea of inherent difference between us and them. He says nothing really happens like that. You don't have this kind of, you know, fully formed ideology of racism that you then go and you kind of just like impose or enact within that context. You already have these practices which are diverse and as I say, evolve over a long period of time, happening within the European context itself, and then they can be applied at a later date. And he calls this racialism rather than racism, to imply that it's not a fully fledged ideology that is only about kind of you know, this kind of hierarchy that we create. It's more about differentiation than hierarchy. It then solidifies into hierarchy with a kind of imposition of what he calls the racial regime of whiteness within the Americas, particularly within North America, where this idea of whiteness then kind of solidifies as the form of racial rule that takes precedence over other types of racial rule. But this isn't a given. This is something that has to be developed over time.
Okay. So there's this complex genealogy of racism, racialism, and racism, and this is also again a bit in this respect a naive question, but where do you see the role of the social sciences in dealing with race, racialism, racism?
Well, I mean, the social sciences are many, right? And traditionally, I mean, if you think about it, if you look at the kind of the genesis of the university, and particularly, you know, Sylvia Wynter, for example, a Caribbean scholar, would talk about the humanities, but I think we can include the social sciences in this, have been vehicles for racism and colonialism, right? So if you look at the history of sociology, for example, classically, and Raymond Connell writes about this, the comparative method, which is developed, which relies on this kind of idea of, you know, being able to compare different societies to each other, rely on the access to colonized societies in order for these comparisons to take place or to be, you know, to be made. And we don't often think about this because we think of the social sciences or science in general as being kind of neutral spaces. But what we actually have to see is how all of these institutions are involved, not just through, for example, being established on colonized land, or with very, very obviously, in many cases, with enslaved labor, right? So there's a kind of a direct link between the university and colonialism and slavery, but also how the social sciences and science in general are used to legitimate ideas about superiority and inferiority. So simple things that we take for granted, like, you know, IQ testing. We know that this has been developed in order to be able to, which is modeled on a kind of a vision of who is intelligent and who is not intelligent, which disadvantages people who traditionally have been thought of as less intelligent, because of course that's part of how racism functions. It's also about imputing different degrees of intelligence to different groups within the population in order to justify and legitimate why some people were forced to work under certain conditions, or why their lives were considered less than, or why they were considered expendable and killable, right? So the social sciences have always been involved, intimately involved in that. If we look, today, there's so many ways in which the social sciences are involved in, for example, think about things like, criminology. So there's a lot of very good critical criminology that's done that looks at the carceral system, looks at practices of, incarceration of Black and Indigenous people, death in custody, all that kind of thing. But there's also, I think, the dominant stream within that kind of, branch of the social sciences is in order to, provide or develop policy that legitimates the status quo. The same thing we can say for migration studies. So by talking about things like migration flows or migration waves or managed migration, these are all ideas that begin within the social sciences, and then with, in the nexus with policy, participate in developing the kinds of policy that can then be used to legitimate or enact the murderous kind of border regimes that we're familiar with today. So there's always this kind of paradox, because of course there's critical scholarship, we're part of it, exists within the university, but we're also working within a university system, and more generally a kind of an epistemic landscape which is grounded on that kind of colonial and degrading kind of practices that always make some people, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore would say, more vulnerable to premature death, and other people more free.
Yeah. So it sounds like a very difficult landscape with all these different I don't know how to put it, with all these different positioning vis-a-vis race and vis-a-vis racialism. And I'll come back to some of these issues as they relate to your own research. The next question I was going to ask you is about multiculturalism, because it also appears to be central in your work. What is your understanding of it on the one hand, and maybe talk about some of your earliest encounters with it?
Yeah, so Gavan Titley and I wrote this book, which came out in 2011, called The Crises of Multiculturalism. And I can't believe now we're talking almost 20 years ago. If you remember, I think it is 20 years ago, in 2004, when I think both Angela Merkel, when she was chancellor, I think the first time around, and David Cameron, if you remember, that guy who weirdly has now come back as a foreign minister in the UK, but I don't think for very much longer. He was the prime minister at the time. And they both said that multiculturalism was a failure, if you remember. Maybe you're too young to remember, I don't know. But that was the big news of the day. Multiculturalism is a failure. And it's a failed experiment. And the idea had been, according to these politicians and pundits, that, integration was supposed to have been the rationale behind multiculturalism. So people who had migrated to what were considered to be both post-colonial societies, particularly in Europe, and interestingly, the Anglo-settler states like Australia and Canada, which are still very much settler colonies, were also thought of as post-colonial, and sort of migration societies, that they had generously accepted these migrants who'd been allowed to live there. And there had been a recognition in the 1970s that assimilation wasn't possible. You couldn't force migrants to give up all of their kind of cultural tradition and heritage and ways of being and ways of life and so on, and that you would allow people to, in their private spheres and sometimes in public under quite circumscribed conditions, practice their culture. But that generally the idea is that, society would look like a kind of a salad where it's one kind of unified whole, but, we could see all the different ingredients of the salad, etc. So that was the kind of the logic. And in the early 2000s, it was decreed to have been a failure. And it's mainly decreed to have been a failure, not that multiculturalism hadn't been opposed very strenuously all along by many figures, but it was considered to be a failure very much within the context of the so-called war on terror. So after 9/11, which, as we know, it's not a kind of a eureka moment. There are many antecedents going back, many years. And in fact, we can look at the Palestinian struggle for liberation as being key to this. I think, the designation of the Palestinian terrorist as particularly nefarious leads up to this moment where Muslims in general and the so-called Islamist terrorist is seen as the absolute folk devil that needs to be combated at all costs. This comes to a head, obviously, with 9/11. And after that, that legitimates all kinds of practices that we're aware of, including torture and black sites and you name it. And obviously, massive war and destruction in Afghanistan and Iraq, but within the European landscape and in countries like Canada, Australia, and so on, this idea that, this has all gone too far. Interestingly, in Australia, they do still have a discourse of official state multiculturalism, but there's also a lot of backlash against multiculturalism. So all of this led us to write this book, which we started working on, I guess, around 2008, where we tried to discuss, what is going on? Like, why is multiculturalism, which after all had been a politics of accommodation in many ways, a politics that were really introduced in order to lock down on any kind of Black and migrant radicalism in the so-called post-colonial era. So you have, I said earlier, like I had been inspired by these anti-racist, anti-colonial, Pan-Africanist movements, but, the state obviously didn't like them at all. So they wanted to clamp down on them. And somebody like Paul Gilroy wrote about this in the the late 1980s, Sivanandan, other people have written very beautifully about those uprisings, and then the states clamp down on them. And multiculturalism is really brought in as a kind of a way of trying to contain Black and migrant radicalism, and any kind of solidaristic politics between different peoples of color who are all migrants within these contexts. And so then it's rather paradoxical that multiculturalism is then seen as having gone too far and having, brought about kind of a lack of social cohesion and a threat to so-called indigenous culture within European states and so on and so forth. So what we were trying to look at is, what was going on with that, and why, what was the designation of multiculturalism as this massive problem? What was that doing in terms of the reproduction of racism? So what we were arguing was that the way racism looks today is through, or we can understand how racism acts today, rather, or what it does today, through this idea that multiculturalism has gone too far. So that discourse and the policies that it then enacted allowed all kinds of racism to take place. And in fact, I think what we're seeing today with this kind of out and out nativism, racial nationalism, and kind of fascism, very apparent in Europe, is the logical consequence of the kinds of policies that were allowed to be brought in on the back of calling multiculturalism a failure. So if you think about the policies against asylum seekers, I mean, in those days, you already had people mooting things like offshore detention for migrants, or, not allowing people to come to the country, putting them in detention centers. I mean, we had all of those things already. I mean, there were detention centers in the 90s and the 2000s, but the kinds of mass drownings at sea that we see in the Mediterranean, and the policy of refusing to save people who are drowning or pushing them back out to sea, and just accepting that thousands of people are going to drown. And sorry, I know this is very triggering and traumatic, but this is what's happening, right?
Yeah.
I think at that time, it would have been a lot more difficult to accept in Europe. I'm not saying that everybody was super left-wing and loved migrants, not at all. But I think it's that you had to build the architecture, the political architecture that made it possible for this level of death to be acceptable. And that took time. And that it relates to what I was saying earlier about race and that more historical context. There's not a boom moment, right? Everything takes time to develop, and things have to be made acceptable. It has to become acceptable to the public that this is how we treat, human life. And it's not that we don't have old patterns to draw on, because of course we have many historical examples of exactly the same kinds of practice. Well, not exactly the same, but similar outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Based on similar understandings of who counts as really human, whose life, as I said before, is preservable and whose life is killable, right? But this particular vision of things that we're seeing today, and that we've been seeing over a number of years, had to be brought to the public after a time when people were accepting of a kind of a multiculturalism, because there was actually quite a lot of public acceptance of multiculturalism. And so you had to orchestrate a politics of anti-multiculturalism at this particular time.
Okay. So it also puts one in mind, or at least me, when you're talking about the acceptance of a discourse that created the acceptance of mass death of the situation right now in Palestine. But maybe we'll have still a chance to look at that later. So
yeah,
at the term racialism, racism, and multiculturalism. And the third, which I would like us to consider, I will actually not name it first because a few of my previous interviewees have expressed their reservations about this term. So I'm going to try to reformulate it.
Yeah.
And then see if we end up with the same term after all. I will at the end. I will at some point name it explicitly. But the question is, if you could talk about your earliest experiences of having a sense of agency and influence in your own affairs, in your own life, and how that affected your thinking and feeling.
Oh, that's interesting. I think a lot of this has to do with, it depends on what sphere you're talking about, because I think depending on what sphere you're talking about, my answer would be different.
Yeah.
So, I think that
I would rather give you the lead on these spheres.
No. I'm thinking aloud, but I don't think anybody's ever asked me this question. So I think that's why I have to think about it a little bit.
There's a very specific expression I could use in this connection, but because it's been like kind of made aware to me that this is can be problematic, I'll come back to it, or I'll name it a bit later. I'll just say for now, sense of agency and influence.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I might subvert the question, because, of course, the question of agency has been turned on its head by many thinkers. Agency is quite a sort of a white Western concept, which is bound up with the ideas of the individual. The idea, going back to the Enlightenment, I suppose, that everybody is kind of in charge of themselves and has the ability to make decisions, to think about what they want to do and then to act upon it, right?
Yeah.
Ability to make choices and to change their circumstances. These are very epistemically white Western ideas about human beings, right? And I'm not saying that I sit outside of that at all, because, of course, I was brought up in a white Western environment, notwithstanding the kinds of issues of being a minority and so on that I spoke about earlier, for want of a better expression. And so I'm not outside of it, but I've always tried to be critical of it, because I don't believe that anything actually happens as a consequence of individual action. I'm a firm believer in, well, firstly, in collective resistance. So I think I would prefer the term resistance over agency, or certainly of influence, which I find quite problematic. And also in terms of collective learning or collective study. And this, I guess, interestingly, so when did I feel that I had, let's say we're calling it agency? it relates to this question that I said quite a long time back in our conversation about not having any teachers or guides and having to be sort of to find out my own direction about what I thought about things based on my own study and kind of talking to people and so on. Yeah. It means that what has become very important to me over time is looking to the collective also for my learning, right? So there are people who I will talk to on a regular basis, like daily and several times a day, and I'll check in with them about my thinking and ask them to corroborate it or to give me advice. And sometimes they're much younger than me, because I really believe in the power of intergenerational communication. Yeah. I think this idea that, it's also a very Western idea of progress, right? There's a kind of a step by step when we go up, either in our own lives or we become more and more intelligent, and then we die, or as societies, the societies have to progress to this kind of developmental idea, in which we would all become, akin, all those societies become akin to white Western societies or European societies, which of course are the ideal, and they created themselves in their own image. So I don't know if that's an answer to you, but that's what your question triggered for me. Let's put it that way.
No, it is an answer, most certainly. And the problematic term which was used was empowerment. And you referred to resistance. So I was thinking there seems to be always an antagonistic moment where one force meets another, so to speak.
Yeah, but I think maybe the idea of empowerment was being criticized because, again, it does tend to smack of this kind of individualist notion that we can become empowered to do something. But then what falls away from that discourse is, well, what empowers certain people over others? And actually power and the structures of power are what fall away, because it is the structures of power, which are, again, the structures of colonialism and racial hierarchy and so on that we've been speaking about, that create the conditions of empowerment or of agency, right? These can be, these are sort of similar terms, and making the assumption that anybody can become empowered. I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but for some people, if you just do X, Y, and Z, then you too can exceed this kind of level and so on. What falls away is kind of an analysis of, well, what's happening around us? What is the landscape in which all of this is happening? And so therefore, resistance, which always has to be collective, because it can't be individual. You're not going to win anything if you try to resist yourself. I mean, if you try, you'll probably be defeated, particularly if it's in a situation of kind of antagonism, as you said. And so then, therefore, you need to be together with others.
Okay.
Which doesn't necessarily imply violence. I'm talking about, it can be just your everyday going about your life.
It could be multi-pronged. The next one is the next complex of question is a bit difficult because I'm not sure now if it could be offensive. I hope not, but it's just taking a bit of a critical view. And you are presently working and writing and living in Australia. And this has a complex and challenging history. Even when you introduce yourself immediately, you acknowledge the people who originally lived in the location of Sydney. And without wishing to put you on the spot, historical details, etc., but from the, say, early 21st century, from the situation of Australia, what can be some of the, so to speak, lessons that can be taken away as regards race, racialism, racism, and where do you see some of the development and tendencies?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, I would say that the people of these lands are still very much here, notwithstanding, obviously, genocide enacted by settlers going back to 1788. But I think it's interesting because I often say that Australia is the place to look to if you want to understand how race functions.
Mm-hmm.
But it is often neglected as a site of study for various reasons to do, which are quite boring. Some of them are boring to do with, well, I mean, they're not boring in the sense that they link totally to the question that you asked me about the social sciences, and which I kind of took to the academy or to universities more generally, in the sense that there's no investment here almost at all in the study of race. You certainly don't. And I'm not saying that that's a done deal anywhere else. And in Europe, it's also very, very complex, right? There's not a lot of places where you can go and study race in Europe either. And so it's not a unique situation to Australia. But it does kind of mean that for many people who want to study these topics here, they tend to look to the US American literature. And of course, that's been massively influential on me also. And that's fine. We can use all manner of texts and thinkers and, activist histories and history in general to understand how race functions, because race, after all, is a global project, right?
Yeah.
But what I find really problematic is that often that study progresses as though nothing was happening here and nobody was thinking or writing about these things here at all. And that simply isn't the case. Particularly Indigenous writers, thinkers, and activists have always been theorizing their own condition, but also just generally the condition of settler colonialism on these lands, right? So there's a lot of very kind of fertile thinking that's happening, particularly, I would think, among organizers. Like everywhere, it's always people in movements who are doing the most interesting and cutting edge theorizing, and the academy has to catch up with it because of the disconnect often between scholarship or scholars and ordinary everyday people. Not that we're not part of society. I think it's important to say that we are, but there is often that disconnect. And the institution encourages that disconnect at the same time. They like to talk about public engagement and all that kind of thing, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about organizing together with ordinary people when we talk about public engagement. That's a completely different thing. And so, so what are the most important things? So, for example, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, which obviously we know is a global movement, but in so-called Australia, there's its own iteration, which really came to the fore, of course, in the context of the murder of George Floyd. But you had a linking up of those global events to ongoing struggles of the families of people who have been killed in custody. So this is Aboriginal people who have been killed by the state. And there's what can only be described as just a mass. This is a mass phenomenon. In the early 1990s, there was a so-called Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. And since then, over 550 people have been killed by the state, which is enormous. And I don't like to talk about proportionality because I don't like counting people in such a way. But if we consider that Aboriginal people make up around 3% of the population, it's just a huge number of people. And none of the recommendations that were called for by the Royal Commission, so this is 1991, so it's a really, really long time ago, none of those recommendations were put in place. And if those recommendations had been put in place, very simple things, many of them, then a lot of these deaths could have basically not happened. And it's by, certain things have improved due to the work of tireless Indigenous abolitionist activists. So one person I'm thinking of, for example, is Latoya Aroha Rule, whose brother was killed in custody because he was forced into what's called a spit hood. So it's a horrible device that they put over people's heads in order to restrain them. And so Latoya and their family campaigned to have these spit hoods banned in South Australia, and that successfully happened. And now there's a national level campaign to have these things, these practices banned. There are endless kind of inquests and inquiries into deaths in custody. And there are many Indigenous organizations, especially led, as I said earlier, by families whose whose family members have been killed,
Yeah.
who are kind of giving testimony, reporting on these incidents. But it's an ongoing struggle. But the thing that I find problematic and a lot of Indigenous people talk about is the insufficient kind of linking up of issues. So one area where this has actually been very encouraging is in the context of the genocide in Palestine, where there's been a link up of struggles between Palestinian people and Indigenous people here around shared, indigeneity and shared resistance against genocide and colonialism. But I don't think it's widespread enough. And certainly there isn't the kind of recognition of the necessity to think relationally and to act relationally around these topics in order to bring about some kind of change.
What do you think are the main obstacles to this kind of cooperation?
Well, somebody like Aileen Moreton Robinson, who's a critical Indigenous and race scholar in this country, has written about what she calls the possessive investment in whiteness. And she writes about how that also extends to migrants to so-called Australia. So very much you see that kind of history of after the end of the White Australia policy, so the Immigration Restriction Act, which was in place in practice really until the early 1970s, when so-called non-white people were allowed to migrate here because, they simply needed it within, in order to be able to survive economically. You see this kind of progressive inclusion of non-Indigenous migrants into the polity under very kind of circumscribed conditions, right? So there's a particular way in which you can be integrated, and that's within, as I said earlier, this kind of official state multiculturalism in Australia. So successive politicians from both right and left will talk about Australia being the most successful multicultural country in the world. And there's there's a tone of menace there. There's a tone of threat, right? So we are the most successful multicultural country. And you're not to step outside of that, right? So Gavan and myself in our book, The Crises of Multiculturalism, talk about good and bad diversity. And you can really see that in place here. So there's a good way to be an Australian migrant or a migrant to Australia. And there's a bad way to be. And the bad way to be a migrant to Australia is to identify with Indigenous people, because that puts you, beyond the pale. Because the reason for migration to shore up the settler population against the Indigenous population. And you might be saying, oh, well, they're only 3%. Like, who cares? There's not that many of them, right? But, integral to the settler condition is the deep knowledge that we are all usurping Indigenous people and dispossessing them on a daily basis of their land and of their sovereignty. That's something that's very well known to people, even if they deny it, right? It's like imbricated in what it means to be a settler, right? And particularly for people who, can trace their history back to the early settlers, right? And so therefore, you kind of buy into that project or you don't. And if you think about the reason the majority of people migrate to Australia, myself included, I'm definitely not excluding myself from that, is because it affords you a particular kind of lifestyle, right? Which then means that you have to turn off that part of your brain that that wants to think about, well, what are my privileges? At whose cost do my privileges come, right? But I think more and more people are standing with Indigenous people. We can see over the last years, many more people participating in kind of refusing the settler ceremonies, in particular so-called Australia Day, which we, Indigenous people call Invasion Day, because it's celebrated on the literal day that the land was invaded, 26th of January. But will it go from there, from this kind of symbolic and more performative politics, to actual decolonization? And what does that mean, right? So, like, we're looking at Palestine and we're saying, well, I think, and maybe this is a harsh or controversial thing to say,
Yeah.
The only way in which decolonization is going to be achieved is for a sizable number of colonizers to leave.
Yeah.
I don't personally see another way in which that can happen. And then over time, perhaps we can see working towards, one democratic state for the people who remain. But I personally think that at least has to be on the table, right? That at least has to be on the table. And in this place, I don't think that really is on the table. And I think we need to start asking ourselves why, self-included, right? Self-included as somebody who's not from here, and I don't see myself as ending my days here at all, far from it. Yeah. I think all of us have to pose the questions to ourselves. Like, it can't be just a theoretical issue. It has to be a practical issue. And then that leaves a lot of questions unturned. So what about people who are refugees? What about people who've come here because they have nowhere else to go? And so on and so forth. These are unresolved questions here and in other settler colonial places.
So